Hey guys, Pete here. Today I'll be talking about House of the Dragon Episode 8, the one where we finally reached the point we were rushing to, the end of one of our main characters' stories. This involved another big time jump that I thought felt a lot more abrupt than the previous one, but I don't want to dwell on that much because this should be the last one. And perhaps more importantly, the end delivered in a way that it appears to have justified the means. I do think it makes sense to talk about what happened in the years we missed up front, since we get those details spread out over the course of the episode. It's been quite a while since Rhaenyra's funeral, where Aemon claimed Vhagar, and Alicent demanded an eye for an eye. That affair chilled relations for all involved to the point of them just basically staying away from each other. Daemon and Rhaenyra settled in at Dragonstone after their Valyrian-style wedding. They had 2 children together, with a third on the way, and even though when she was young she lamented the idea of being trapped in a castle pumping out heirs, that appears to be the lifestyle she chose as an adult. It does seem to suit her though, and her family turned out a lot more well-adjusted than her half-siblings did in King's Landing. We don't get much about what Daemon's been up to beyond searching for dragon eggs to connect with his Valyrian heritage, but based on the number of kids he's produced, it would appear that he's moved on from his erectile dysfunction phase. In King's Landing, Viserys' health has continued to deteriorate. 20 years ago, he was on the doorstep of death and managed to hang on, but his decaying face tells us that his time on Earth is coming to an end. He spends most of his time in bed loaded to the gills on milk of the poppy, and for what it's worth, it looks like his pain is such that he probably needs it. This means ruling is left to his hand and his queen. Otto and Alicent are in charge, and things seem to be about the same. Beyond a cosmetic shift away from the Targaryen orgy art towards the Faith of the Seven motif, it appears to be business as usual in a Westeros enjoying a peaceful period in its history. As a book reader, I do wonder what happened to Alicent and Viserys' third son, Daeron, who has a fairly major role in what's to come, but I don't see any evidence that he exists in this episode. The other children have mostly shed the endearing traits they exhibited as youngsters to become real pieces of work. That is, with the exception of Helaena, who's been relegated to producing heirs for her older brother Aegon. I don't think they make it explicit how many of those there are, but she does refer to their children when she asks after the serving woman that Aegon raped. Helaena is fast becoming one of my favorite characters because as a dreamer she literally sees future events. But because she's a little weird, no one even notices that the things that she says are prophetic. There's a part of me that hopes that no one ever figures this out, and considering how big of a revelation this would have been for Viserys, I kinda love that he never did. His boys with Alicent turned out to be awful. Aegon is unserious and lecherous, and unsurprisingly, after Aemon claimed the biggest weapon in the realm as a teenager, he became the kind of guy who is in a constant state of sizing everyone up. It's almost as if the author is telling us that it's a mistake to give these people so much power at a young age. What could go wrong? It's also a little baffling that the heir to the Iron Throne, who knows that their claim will likely be challenged, hasn't been trying to secure her position in the capital. We do know that Viserys was opposed to the idea of Daemon and Rhaenyra getting together. They also did that rather quickly after their respective partners died, which would have been seen as disrespectful. So maybe there was real tension after they got married. That is how it played out in the book, but they changed a lot about the period of when that relationship developed for the show. There were a few times when I was watching this episode where I was like, the show is really leaning towards Rhaenyra and her family in an uncomfortable way. I went into this episode expecting to see Rhaenyra calling for Sir Vaemon's head and then feeding his body to Syrax before they ever went to King's Landing, where all of his people would get their tongues cut out. And with the added twist of Laenor's ending last week, her side was starting to feel like the flawed but ultimately good force coming up against the evil that is the Hightowers in a story that I never read in such a black and white way. You had pure little perfect angels that through no fault of their own had to deal with the stigma of being bastards versus a raper and an unhinged looking warrior with a giant chip on his shoulder. So I was pleasantly surprised when fate intervened in the closing moments to at least keep things interesting. But at the same time, it brings up some other questions that we'll get into later. The thing that brings them all together is a potential crisis in Velaryon land. We get an exposition dump of a short conversation at high tide between Rhaenys and Corlys's brother Vaemond. Apparently the Sea Snake has been off fighting in the Stepstones again for 6 years, and he suffered a severe injury that may be the end of him. Vaemond channels his second son energy and makes his case that he should inherit the throne rather than Rhaenyra's son Luke. It's interesting that there's no mention of Laena's line whatsoever in any of these conversations. Baela is on hand to witness the conversation, and she sends word to her father Daemon at Dragonstone. The show spends a few moments to show us that nothing really important happened in the 6 years that we missed out on. Jason Joffrey grew some, Rhaenyra is pregnant again, and she and Daemon seem to be just living their lives at Dragonstone, being as Targaryen as possible. Even though Alicent and Otto are running things in King's Landing, and you would imagine that they would have gotten word that the king's health was in bad shape, apparently there hasn't been a good reason to visit there in all that time. We're also meant to infer that beyond sending Baela to be a ward of House Velaryon, they never really patched things up in relation to their plan to make everyone fear they were capable of killing Laenor, and the effect that would have on his mother and father. Because Vaemond and Rhaenys are on their way to discuss succession in King's Landing, they do decide to follow to try to protect Luke's claim. The tone is set when no one comes to welcome them. This was a deliberate slight, and I loved announcing their titles to basically no one. But I also like the subtle differences in how the Red Keep looks so lifeless compared to how we saw things back in episode 1 in the early days of Viserys' reign. When they go inside, Rhaenyra mentions that she doesn't recognize the Red Keep with all the 7-pointed stars everywhere. And when we get a look at the small council, we see that Alicent is rocking a rather large one around her neck. I believe what they're going for here is that she's trying to be repentant for what she did at the end of the last episode. She knew that what happened there would get out and people would think she was mad, and I believe this is all part of trying to rehabilitate her image. It also sets her apart from this family that she's married into, but it also may work to make her more relatable to the people who are largely religious. On her way to greet Rhaenyra, Alicent gets news of that delicate situation that happened in Aegon's quarters. She gets this news from Eric Cargill, and there's a funny thing here of him being a twin. You have Eric and Eric that sound pretty similar but are spelled differently. He kind of brings this up when she doesn't realize which one she's talking to, and we do see the two twins sparring together later in the scene in the yard. Her having to go talk to Diana gives Rhaenyra a chance to go see her father first, and when you see the cobwebs on his giant model of Valyria, you know that things are not as they once were. They find him in bed where he's completely broken and bedridden. They mention the issue of succession at Driftmark and how they need his support, and then they introduce him to their two children, Aegon and Viserys. I always enjoyed the fact that Rhaenyra and Daemon named their first child together Aegon, sort of as an FU to Alicent. And when the king learns that they named their second son Viserys, he gets a smile on his face and says, now that is a name fit for a king, which was a great little moment. He brightens up at first, and then we see that this pain is real and it overtakes him to the point that he asks for his milk of the poppy. As I've already mentioned, Aegon is a terrible human. He raped one of the servants, and that sets up a complex, if not uncomfortable, conversation between her and Alicent. She does comfort the young woman while threatening her at the same time. This response doesn't seem like it's the first time that she had to deal with this. It doesn't necessarily seem out of line for what someone in her position might say to someone in this position. I think they may be saying that she can see some of herself in this person while still being in a position where she basically lords over her. And because of what happened in the last episode and the way this character's been developing, I felt like there was a real chance that it might have been a farce and that there was poison in that cup rather than moon tea. She then goes to her son, who tries to say it was harmless fun and play it off. I'm not really a proponent of people slapping their children, even when they're adults, but you kind of see where this one comes from. And when she says that he's no son of hers, it also kind of feels like her being awful, but I think it's also supposed to read that she really has no idea what to do with him anymore. He laments that he tries so hard and it'll never be good enough, and frankly, we haven't seen enough of any of that to have that carry any weight. I think this uncertainty about her son's fitness to rule ties into her feeling uneasy about making Vaemond the heir. But Otto does what Otto does and makes a fair case about putting a child in charge of the biggest fleet in Westeros, which, would make sense if the whole system wasn't built on doing exactly that. Luke wouldn't be the first case where this has happened, not by a long shot, and if they were truly worried about his age, they could just as easy make Vaemond or Rhaenys the regent until he got older. It's all about calling Rhaenyra's claim into question, and this is the exact type of maneuvering they claim to be afraid will happen if she becomes the queen. Rhaenyra goes to Rhaenys, who is understandably still upset because she thinks she had her son killed so that she can marry Daemon. Rhaenyra tries to argue her case, which after all, she's not lying, she didn't have Laenor killed. But Rhaenys doesn't think it matters because the Hightowers are still going to come out on top. Even when presented with a marriage proposal that would solve all their problems, she decides to stand on her own. And it's worth noting that this would also solve Vaemond's problem about the bloodline being snuffed out too. But even that isn't enough to convince her to go against Otto and Alicent because she believes they're going to force her to her knees. With things looking grim, Rhaenyra goes to see her father to ask for his help one more time. She asks about Aegon's dream and points out that he said that a Targaryen had to rule to keep the realm together, but by naming her heir, he divided it. She questions whether she wants it because it's a heavy burden to bear, and so she asks him to defend her and her children, but he's so hopped up on milk of the poppy that he doesn't respond to anything she says. The next day we get a look at his morning routine. Whatever is happening with him, they never really make it clear. It looks unbelievably painful. He still has the sores that we first saw in episode 1, and there isn't much more left of him. As the maesters are tending to him, he tells Otto that he wants to have dinner with his whole family. At court, Otto sits the throne as hand and Vaemond makes his plea. They pretty much set up what he says here with the words that he spoke at Laena's funeral. In his mind, he's golden. He has the truth, he has the hand, the queen, and Rhaenys behind him. And he essentially does right up until Viserys walks through the door. In a shocking turn of events, he hobbles his way to take his place on the Iron Throne as the King of the Seven Kingdoms. This was a terrific surprise that you didn't really see coming, and I loved how they stretched it out so that we could feel how difficult this was for him to do. The reactions on everyone's faces while this is happening are priceless. Rhaenyra sees her father come through for her. The Greens realize they were on the verge of setting things in motion for Aegon's ascension, and they have the rug pulled right out from underneath them. And based on the history between these two brothers that we've seen play out through the first 7 episodes, it really landed when we saw him drop his crown and Daemon come to help him make it the rest of the way. Viserys says he's surprised because Rhaenys is right there and surely she can tell the court what her husband's wishes are. She makes a real-time decision to leave Vaemond holding the bag and jumps right back over to support Luke and Rhaenyra. This guy hasn't done much to endear himself to fans, but you have to feel for him at that moment. He's left alone looking straight up treasonous on what was supposed to be his big day. He would have had a big come up here, and when all was said and done, the crown would have owed him. Instead, he gets baited into telling the truth in front of everyone, and before Viserys can take his tongue for it, Daemon chops his head in two, while managing to leave the tongue there just in case Viserys wants to have his go. There is so much to like about this scene that I'll definitely come back to. I mean, you had the culmination of the arc between these brothers when they had their moment on the stairs. But what stood out to me on the first watch was how even though everyone knew Vaemond was telling the truth, even the Hightowers, who were unmistakably on his side, knew that this was the inevitable outcome for saying what he said. It's like we were right there with you right up until you took Daemon's bait and said those words out loud. And then, well, what did you expect would happen? It's all wrapped up in this moving scene from a character we spent enough time with to give it some real emotional weight. And it's all about an unspoken agreement to maintain a lie. It's like the golden mask he wears to cover his face. If we all agree it's not hiding a hideous wound, then it isn't there. It's about the nature of power and what people believe that is, and even though his is absolute, it's also something that he has to wield. because if not, someone else will step into that space. And there's a short scene with Rhaenys contemplating what just happened. You have to imagine she's also thinking about the children that she lost 6 years ago and what she might do next. And then they all gather for dinner where she's notably absent. Things start off somewhat awkward. Enough time has passed that these people don't really know each other anymore. And after Viserys is carried in, he pleads for them all to set aside their differences. He pulls a legendary move when he takes off the mask. He wants them to see him not as the king, but who he really is. A father, a brother, a husband, a grandsire. And in that instant, it seems like it might work. This is a man who spent his life trying to rule in a way that would make everyone happy, which is, of course, an impossible dream. He was ultimately ineffective in that role, but here he doesn't see why this can't happen inside his own family. If not for the crown, if not for the House of the Dragon, then what about just for him? After all, despite his shortcomings, his has been a life of duty. Rhaenyra is moved and she makes a toast to Alicent for staying by her father's side and apologizes. Alicent reciprocates and says that Rhaenyra will make a fine queen. And when this plays out in the book, it sounds more like they're putting on a show to make the king feel better, but here it looks somewhat sincere. It's as tenuous as it is genuine though, and we see that all of the kids haven't gotten the memo. Aegon continues to be the worst, insulting Jace by propositioning his new future wife Baela. Even here though, he's able to pull it back and decides to toast his uncles instead of getting into an argument. When Viserys calls for music, it looks as though what he was saying might have gotten through. Jace asks Helena to dance just because I think he sort of feels bad for her since no one treats her that well. And the king gets his moment to enjoy familial bliss before his pain kicks back in and he has to be taken out of the room. Here is where you see that his presence, and I guess by extension his power, is necessary to make this work. When a roast pig is placed in front of Aemon, bringing up memories of the Pink Dread, Luke gives a little giggle, and that leads to a final toast from One Eye. In that, he calls them strong boys as an end around to calling them bastards, and a fight breaks out. He's ready to go, and it looks like he could probably take them both out at the same time, but Daemon gets between them to break it up. This is somewhat unintentionally funny since he looks like a mini version of Daemon with an eye patch put on him so that you could tell them apart, and they both have that I'm the little brother anyway, so I've got nothing to lose energy. You can tell that the younger man has a reverence for his uncle though, so it does end there, but I feel like you're supposed to wonder who might come out on top if these two actually went at it. In just a few minutes after everything appeared to be coming together, Rhaenyra decides that they should probably make their way back to Dragonstone. Part of why I felt that their toasting was sincere is because Alicent seems to want her old friend to stay. Rhaenyra feels this too and says she'll return on Dragonback after she gets her children home. There's a brief transition where we check in with Mysaria, who we haven't seen for quite a while. We find out that this servant from the Red Keep, Talia, works for her and is feeding her information. In this episode, she was the one who gave Alicent the moon tea for Diana. Talia has shown up in previous episodes. The first one that comes to mind is her passing through Alicent's room while she was having dinner with Larys. It kind of stood out there to see someone who worked for her walking through whenever she was having a private conversation. Right now, this is just something to keep in the back of our minds because there's no indication of how Mysaria will use this information. The episode comes to an end in Viserys' bed. His wife comes to him and gives him his milk of the poppy, and he starts to talk thinking that she's Rhaenyra. He answers her question from the last late night meeting that they had, telling her that he does believe Aegon's dream is true. This works to confuse Alicent into thinking that he's talking about their son Aegon instead of the Conqueror, and when he says it's you are the one, you must do this, she thinks he's asking her to put him on the throne. She leaves him to sleep, saying that she understands, and we see a shot of his dagger. He says no more and reaches out his hand. There's a gasp, a tear. He says, "My love," which I think it's safe to say he's referring to Emma. And then Viserys of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, closed his eyes and went to sleep. He never woke. He was 52 years old and had reigned over most of Westeros for 26 years. And I won't read the next line from the book because episode 8 ends there. Overall, a great ending to Viserys' story. This episode delivered a satisfying conclusion that elicited an emotional response that I found lacking in most of the other deaths we've seen, with an exception being his wife Emma in the first episode of the series. He referred to that as a wound that would never heal, and then his whole body appears to have become that same thing. Really though, it was a superb performance by Paddy Considine, bringing this complicated tragic character to life and making his death feel like it mattered. There were just so many chances for things to go differently. He could have named Aegon the heir the day he was born. Or he could have prepared Rhaenyra and the realm for her rule. He could have made her the Hand instead of bringing Otto back. He could have recognized the kids' parentage and legitimized them. He could have married her to Aegon. He could have married Jace to Helaena. I mean, the list goes on. There were a lot of alternate routes that maybe don't fall apart so easily when he mistakes Alicent for his daughter and starts popping off about a prophecy. That twist was something I struggled with on the first watch. It does feel like it balances things out in a story that was starting to skew heavily in favor of Rhaenyra, but it also felt like it made things smaller in a way. We had all this buildup that provided some insight into why Alicent saw things the way she did, and this could undermine a lot of that. This isn't something from the book. The prophecy itself isn't in there at all. And it feels like this gives her a clear-cut reason to block Rhaenyra's claim. At the same time, it's a little early to assign the simplest explanation of what they might be trying to do. It did give them the chance to swerve once and have everybody come together, only for that to fall apart. And admittedly, part of my reaction comes from this being different than what I was expecting, and that's where things get interesting. Because here is the thing. We know what the historical count says. We know what the Fire and Blood history says about the reign of Viserys Targaryen and his death. And now we're getting a lot more details as to what actually happened. And so I think that it makes sense that a show based on a book that relies on unreliable accounts might raise the question of how reliable that information is. Can you believe what you read when it comes to history? Should you? Because it all comes through someone else after the fact, and I think you should at least keep in mind that it's probably more complicated than it appears. Is that what House of the Dragon is trying to show us? For instance, in this case, the history is written by men in a society that is pretty misogynistic, and therefore women are likely to be painted in an unfavorable light. It's kind of funny because there's a lot of discourse around which side is right, with fans picking a side like they're watching sports. I've never really had a clear favorite because it just seems like trying to decide which group is a little less wrong when the system is there to dictate that they have to fight in the first place. It's all entertaining, but none of it seemed really all that cool to me. Both sides are capable of good and bad, but the clear thing is that no one is better off because of their inability to coexist. I like the idea that it just might be more complicated than what people are basing their beliefs on. I'm not sure if they'll be able to make that work, but it should be fun to watch if that's what they're going for. I've enjoyed this show a lot while having some issues, and over the past 2 episodes, it has started to seem like most of those nitpicks might disappear now that we have real payoffs to things that they've been setting up. We shouldn't be jumping forward in time anymore, and we have the same actors playing the characters from here on out. Viserys' big scenes in this one pair nicely with Alicent and Rhaenyra and Aemon's big ones from last week. I have a good idea of some of what will be happening in the last 2 episodes and think things will only pick up from there. I just think someone ought to listen to Helaena because she actually knows what's going on, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this episode and how things played out at the end there. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.